And we're live, joined by my landlord's dogs, of course, as always. I am Martin van Staden. I'm joined by Morné, Malan, and Zakhele Mthembu. Welcome to this week's edition of The Rational Standard. Today is a interesting day, an important day, I guess, in South Africa. It's Human Rights Day, 21 March. It commemorates, I think, kind of officially the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. And it's been an important day in South Africa's kind of post-apartheid heritage. But March is also an important month for another reason, and that was in the news around the start of this month, and that is that it's the 5-year anniversary, and will keep on being an important anniversary in South Africa of lockdown. Yes, that lockdown of what Zakhele and Gomezi calls the spicy cough. I don't know if it's allowed on YouTube nowadays to talk about it, or whether if they're gonna censor us again. But anyway, on the 23rd of March of the year 2000, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that.
Just like
2020.
Missed it by 20 years.
Sorry, 2020. Yeah, I missed it. Okay.
Yeah.
No, Martin is the one who said 2000, and you also missed it.
You undershot.
The year
overshot.
The year 2020, year zero.
Cyril
Ramaphosa announced that we will be going into a so-called 2-week or 3-week lockdown to balance, to stop the spread or whatever, slow the spread.
To slow the spread.
Yeah, 2 weeks to slow the spread, and that was basically a 2-week lockdown that essentially locked people in their houses all around the country, told them that if they go to work, if they go to buy open-toed sandals, if they go to buy hot chicken as opposed to closed-toed shoes and kind of cold chicken, then you can be arrested and put in a prison cell. It told people to congregate indoors rather than sitting on the beach, for which again they could be arrested if they choose to do that, and really just a host of other ridiculous things that, to be fair, we have memory hold. It is almost as if this never happened. The kind of consequences of that is still around. Unemployment went up. Hundreds of thousands of small businesses around the world had to close for no real good reason. But as we sit here today celebrating Human Rights Day, we still talk about apartheid. Sometimes Marikana is mentioned, but lockdown is never mentioned. Zakhele Mthembu, tell me, where do you think this celebration of Human Rights Day is substantive, especially given all the statements by ministers and government departments that we're bound to see?
That's man. I think you touched on, you touched on a very critical aspect of it, on how since post 94, right? We every time we have huge transgressions of rights, like Marikana, as you've mentioned, we don't forget about that. But lockdown is arguably one of the biggest transgressions of rights we've ever seen being done by the ANC government, and whose consequences, right, from the SRD grants to the high unemployment numbers, we are still the reason the budget was postponed was because there's this huge thing that came in 2020 and just can never leave from the budget, and it costs way more than the 60 billion that the Minister of Finance was looking for. So that is just one of the consequences. But as you've said, we don't think about this. I personally, lockdown for me was as you call the president, Mr. Mr. Ramaphosa. To me, he's Mr. Lockdown. That to me represented a turning point, right? And how comfortable leaders would be to just take away things that you never thought could be taken away from you because you take them for granted, right? So I was a smoker. I used to smoke cigarettes, right? So that was gone. In just from one announcement. I slept the previous day. I went to the shops and bought cigarettes. The next day after that announcement, that very same moment, right, I could not go to my local garage and purchase a packet of cigarettes. It was truly absurd to me, and it just showed me, right, the importance.
For no good reason.
man, for no good reason. For no good reason. Of course, right? Like, if we have to be at least try and strong arm and strong man, you know, the people who voted or who are in favor of that thing, they'd be like, oh no, for epidemiological reasons, you know, cigarettes propagate the spread of the virus somehow. Like you smoking alone in your house, like, oh.
I think when we say for no good reason, we mean that there was a good reason out there somewhere for doing things, but what the government did, actually, there was no relationship between those two things.
Yeah. Like, but it was horrible. It was both scary and eye-opening for me, right? And also it made me appreciate having an incompetent state. Like that was one of the first instances where I was like, man, because I was seeing reports from, you know, New Zealand and stuff, like the New Zealand government knows its business, it works, and it will lock you up. The South African state really, it was as horrible as it was, right? Through like really forced implementation of it, people willingly complying with these regulations, which is always a good thing. You want to see a citizenry following the law or following any directive. So that was, yeah. But in general, following directives is a good thing. Not every directive, but in general, for the rule of law, you know, it's good. It's good. And but it made me appreciate that our state's apparatus was not as efficient as it could be, because that was horrible. Although even as inefficient as it was, right, I used to live back home in Soweto, and I lived close to a police station in Soweto, so my life was a very interesting life, because, you know, the black market sprung up, and, you know, I was just literally 5-minute walk away from a police station, whilst, you know, I had my cigarette dealer and alcohol dealer standing in the corner, just, you know, doing what capitalism allows us to do, which is always amazing to see. So yeah, it was a horrible time, but as you said, we seemingly forgot, because after lockdown ended 2 years later, everyone was like, cool, unemployment, that sucks. It's not like we caused it by forcing businesses not to operate. That sucks. Here are a bunch of grants that were supposed to be temporary, but now are here forever. And yeah, we just move on. Even the grants now, right, they are no longer associated with COVID relief. They are just now pretty much some form of UBI. I'm sure the UBI proponents out there are very happy. So yeah.
No, I mean, whenever I do a lot of editing of kind of op-eds for the Free Market Foundation, and whenever an author says, well, post-lockdown, post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, I always say, lockdown.
Yeah.
The virus didn't jump out of the bushes and tell the government what to do. COVID did not do this. It was government lockdown. Morné, what's your assessment 5 years in?
Yeah, I think that there's still some sort of collective trauma that we all have. Every now and then I just get these flashbacks and I think, wow, what a crazy time. I can't believe there was a time where it was illegal to leave your house, where, you know, you had to have a reason to go to the grocery store. If they found you in your car on the streets and you couldn't explain that you were on your way to the Pick n Pay to pick something up, then that was an offense. And the other thing that I just remembered that was just so depressing to me in the lockdown time is that was the first time I ever felt that I could understand how people, I could understand people's reaction in, Soviet Russia or in communist China or even in the Holocaust. Because you sort of always ask yourself, why does everybody go along with it? What sort of oppressive apparatus do they have to put in place to force everybody to go along with the system? And then you go through something like that and you see, neighbors ratting out their fellow neighbors, saying, okay, no, wait, I saw this one was in the garden with someone that's not in their family, or I saw this one walking down the street, or just all these ridiculous things. And it's just then you can really understand how the mentality behind people who just say, this is what the system says, so this is what we have to do. And also just on the people complying with the orders of the state, that's also another thing that you could see in well, corporate South Africa, but in South Africa generally, is just that all these people were sort of justifying their actions. They were saying, you know, yes, we do have social distancing rules, and yes, we do force you to wear a mask, and yes, we do all these sorts of things. But it's not because the government's telling us to do it. It's because we really genuinely believe in everybody's safety. We really think that you know, we care about our customers or whatever. And then the day after Ramaphosa lifted the law, everybody just stopped. So nothing changed in the virus. One day there was X amount of cases. The next day there was, I think there might even have been more cases. But then we just stopped counting after a while, and then we just said, okay, so I guess it's over. But nothing changed. Nothing. The only thing that changed is the government went from saying you have to do this to saying you don't have to do this, and that really is. As far as I could tell, the vast majority of people, that was their calculus for what they did in lockdown, was just, what does the state tell me to do? And that's what I'm going to do. And no matter how ridiculous it was, because we all sort of agreed that these are absolutely ridiculous provisions. And like Zach said, there was just the entrepreneurial spirit of the black market keeping certain industries alive. And I know, you know, there was even occasions in lockdown, on a lighter note, where if you were a smoker, it was actually more convenient than prior to lockdown. You didn't even have to go to the shop. There was like WhatsApp groups.
They came to you precisely.
It was like Uber Eats for cigarettes. I don't think it wasn't worth the premium.
No,
because that was ridiculous.
No, definitely not.
I mean, you make an important point there, Morné, about kind of, and I mean, this is something that. So I don't generally consider myself naive about the nature of the state, but when lockdown just started, I was like, or well, let's say when lockdown started in China and you kind of saw it in Italy a little bit, I was like, yes, I mean, the world is going crazy. This is now February 2020. And I'm like, at least we as South Africans, we've gone through apartheid. We had the states of emergency. We've kind of seen this movie before. It won't happen here. Because, I mean, we've already said no, we've said never again. We adopted the interim and then the current constitution. It has a whole limitations provision that kind of strictly says that if you want to kind of do a state of emergency, I mean, Section 37 of the Constitution, states of emergency, it kind of regulates it very strictly. And then it has Section 36. It says that if you want to limit rights, that doesn't amount to a state of emergency. This is the steps that you need to follow. And I was like, kind of, cool. So I'm sure the doctors are going to kind of have these little plans and so on. But it's lockdown in South Africa. No, thankfully, that will miss us. Good. So then came March, and I'm like, cool. So that didn't happen, but at least the government won't get away with this, because obviously not. I mean, our lawyers, these are kind of people hardened in the kind of the new constitution, and like they understand the context in which it was adopted, and like you cannot allow the government to do these. I mean, forget about, we all oppose like socialist interventions and the lawyers are okay with it. I'm just talking about, you can't have the government telling you where you can and cannot go in the country. Like, I think all lawyers in South Africa nominally kind of say that, oh, we won't do that again. We tried that during apartheid. It was a disaster. We won't do it again on moral grounds. And I was like, cool. So the courts are going to immediately declare this thing unconstitutional. It's like, maybe it's going to be a hiccup. And yeah, so then the days started ticking past, and then the weeks started ticking past, and then the court cases started coming in, and the judgments started coming in, and I was like, okay, so I've completely misunderstood where we are. And I think, Morné, you made a great point. It doesn't take a lot for a country to become an oppressive state. Like, the government just has to do it, and there's almost a coin toss that the people are just going to fall in with it, or it's going to be so bad that there's going to be open rebellion. Because we saw virtually no resistance in South Africa, despite the brazen unconstitutionality of the lockdown. By any definition of lockdown, state of emergency, state of disaster, that was a state of emergency. It should have been declared in accordance with the Constitution, and it should have followed all the precepts of the Constitution. It wasn't. It was it was almost a rote kind of public policy decision that one minister made, and then that ended basically the economy overnight, as Zake says. And we accepted this, and that makes me question what is there that we wouldn't accept, and if we accepted that, it's very difficult to get worse than that. So it puts a question mark, to me at least, around the staying power and the credibility, really, not the kind of normative credibility. I think it's normatively very credible, but the practical credibility of South Africa's constitutional infrastructure to stop the state, or to at least delay the state in implementing what I would say is the biggest incursion into civil liberty of recent memory. Let me not put a number on it, but in recent memory. And I think that will be the case, for decades. Lockdown is gonna stay the biggest single incursion into civil liberty in recent memory.
Well, I think actually, I think there's a strong argument to be made that this, given the scope, the scope of the incursion and the breadth of it. I mean, it was a global phenomenon. I think there's a very strong argument to be made that this might be the biggest human rights, civil rights abuse in the history of humanity. I think there's a very strong argument to be made, and there have been some terrible things that have happened in human history. But I genuinely think there's a strong argument, because that was government saying. And I mean, Martin, you talked about the constitutionality and the lawyers and all those sorts of things. I was always sort of skeptical of that, especially given how quickly they were allowed to move with all of those regulations. But what surprised me was just that I thought there'd be revolt. I thought, there's no way that they're actually going to be able to implement this, not legally, but practically. I didn't think it was going to be practically possible. And I mean, we referred earlier to one day you could buy certain things and the other day you couldn't buy certain things. But there's another end of that equation as well, and that's the people who were selling those things. Things changed on a dime. You're on a Friday, you think you're going to go to work on Monday. If you work at wherever, name any number of places. So it's sad that I can't go to whatever Tops and get a beer, but there's at least 10 people who thought they were going to work on Monday, and then Sunday evening they found out, nope, you don't have a job. We'll let you know in a month or so. And then a month later they wait on, they have to just wait to find out if they're allowed to go to work the next day. And I mean, that's just on the economic front. On the social front, there was people being denied access to their dying family members. Children couldn't go to school. You couldn't see family. People couldn't get married. You couldn't live. There was nothing you were allowed to do. You weren't allowed to live as a human being with other human beings.
Even conduct funerals or anything like that, right? Like
exactly. And I mean, it changed on a dime without really anybody having to justify anything. There was no real measuring stick for, is this legitimate or is this illegitimate? And I mean, so that's just what really disappointed me, is the fact that they sort of got that done on a practical basis. And the other thing is just, it was just another reminder of how awful the media in South Africa is. And I don't think it's that big of an exception. I think it was a global phenomenon, but my word, there was just this, absolute, it was as close as you could have gotten to the state media, Pravda, home of propaganda kind of thing, where, regardless of, and there were exceptions, but regardless of how ridiculous things got, they were willing to speak power to truth no matter what. I mean, if you had any questions, they would just say, well, this is what the government says, and I mean, that's another legacy, is the whole misinformation, disinformation thing is, and that's where that got started. That's why we have these commissions at
That's
the
why
UN and all those things.
that's why we have things like fact checkers, and like on social media. That's when it started becoming a huge thing, because like what used to be, fringe communities that the Zakheles of the world belong to, talking about how the state is just trying to ruin everything, they became mainstream because we saw it happening in the mainstream, right? And now all those, weird forums that we used to frequent were now just Facebook, posts, and people were talking about how this is horrible. And now there had to be a whole lot of damage control, and like the as you say, the practicality of it, to me, at a mainstream corporate level, right? Like, man, like huge corporates, they just fell in line, like it like they were not gonna be harmed by these some of these regulations. For tech companies, I guess it was like kind of easy for them, given that their profitability is not contingent on whether people are physically active or not in the real world. So maybe that is why they just like, instead, like tech companies made more money during lockdown, right? Whereas the what people would call the real economy, which is a very bad term, but the physical economy, if you were to call it that, it suffered a great deal, and that is the economy that employs a majority of the world, right? And it, man, it was sad, as you said, Morné, because it is very difficult when you are like contingent on a particular income, right? People in the lower rung of like income levels in South Africa were usually paid on a week by week basis. So as you said, after that announcement, right, this person had just received their probably salary this Friday, and they were already planning on getting another one the coming Friday if they would get paid on a week by week basis. And then they had to stop going to work for months on end, and their entire life just got upended, and everyone was comfortable with it. Instead, people like myself who were speaking out against it were called every sort of name in the book, right? Saying that how dare you want old people to die. That was the entire phrase, right? Do you want the vulnerable to die? Do you want people to die? I'll be like, I don't think that it is as dichotomous as they made it seem. And now we know, right? Because nothing changed, as you said, Morné. Like, man, nothing changed from the day before regulations to the day after they got removed. At a substantive level, the virus was still there. There were still cases. Instead, people just stopped caring because the state told them to stop caring, and that was sad on a business level. But on the point of the practicality of the implementation of it, right? I was fortunate enough to live in a township whereby it wasn't as easy to implement it. As I said, I lived right 5 minutes away from a police station, and I had my black market was an actual spot where you could go and find someone who had anything that you needed, from the various taverns and alcohol businesses who resorted to operating at like late hours of the night because patrols weren't as frequent. And then pretty much like the practicality of it, I saw people did not roll over, at least from where I was, because I could see even the day, like the day after the implementation of lockdown, right? In townships, I guess it's the space constraints and everything else that just makes it physically impossible for people to be cooped up indoors the whole day, right? So that just to me was at least an aspect that made me appreciate too not living in suburbia at that time, because I could still go out and talk to people and chill on the streets, and only go back into the yard, run back into the yard when I saw a police van coming, which was something that was pretty cool to experience. Like, yeah, I've experienced real oppression now, people. So, yeah. but outside of that, really, township life, at least from where I was, and I think for a lot of people, if there are any people who live in a township who watch this, right, they would understand that, they would know that it did not change that much outside of official corporate businesses no longer operating.
Yeah,
Well,
I guess. Yeah,
you
well,
can go,
so I
Mark.
mean, that's what I heard as well, and I always praised the townships for that approach, because I think that's the right approach. But unfortunately, a lot of those people obviously worked in the suburbs, worked in the cities, where wealth is concentrated, and so that maybe on a day-to-day basis that lessened the impact, but it didn't really kind of dissolve the, let's say, the broader economic and social trauma that I think Morné kind of alluded to earlier. And like to me, I guess the one of the moments where I realized that actually we're caught in a nightmare was when I think it was Ramampara himself first was in a fake military uniform. I mean, he's the commander-in-chief of the South African National Defense Force. He is allowed to wear a South African Army uniform if he chooses. I wouldn't recommend it by any stretch of the imagination, but he may do that. Instead, he wore some fake kind of camouflage thing that has nothing to do with our military. And then the Minister of Tourism, I think a few months later, with a little what do you call it, hat, a little military hat. I think it had a beret. Yes, I think it had some symbol
like
on
a Cuba thing or something.
Yeah, I'm thinking communist symbology on her beret now, but I can't
it was a red star, I think.
But she also had
it was a red star.
It was, yeah, and she also had a military. I wouldn't call it a uniform. She had like a T-shirt with camouflage on, and this was during the time of the COVID Command Council. It's like we have this thing about that's kind of regiment society, a very militarized kind of vibe around it. Even though the military, like when this thing started, there was like reports that 70,000 troops are deploying, biggest deployment of the army in forever, I think, since the border war. I saw the one time during the whole lockdown that I saw the military was when I was speeding home from my parents to get in before midnight when the lockdown was started. On the other side of the highway, I saw a Casper kind of infantry vehicle lying on its roof. That's the only time I saw the military. After that, I never saw the military again. And yet we had this militarized kind of lockdown. And the point I'm making is that it was to our political class, it was a joke. I mean, it was role play. It was role play. They were like,
it was a dream come true to them.
No, it's a dream come true. But they were having fun. Yeah, they were having fun.
Yeah.
To them, it was an like, oh, this is the moment, because Ramampara on the one hand, from the first week, they told him decisive leadership. Like finally we see we've been told that this guy doesn't have backbone. But now the media says, look, finally, here's Ramaphosa now. Yeah, here he is. And we start calling him kind of like the family meetings. He never took one question from a journalist at these bloody things. And the press was just like, oh, it's great. He's called another family meeting. Yay, we're going to get information. Like they were having the time of their lives. And not just, I mean, when I use the term political class, I use it very specifically. It's not like just politicians and bureaucrats. It's the journalists. It's the academics. For that period, it was the doctors. It's the intelligentsia in our society. They were having the absolute time of their lives while, and I mean, Morné, the thing you say about the trauma, I mean, by the second year of lockdown, I was starting to worry because this thing had no end in sight. Like they kept renewing this thing. And I was like, my God, how long is this going to go on? And I was starting to worry that for babies that were born, say, in March 2020, the only faces that they've seen for 2 years were the faces of their parents, but a stranger was always half a face. Like their whole existence for like the first 3 years of a child's life, some say, is the most important for socialization. For 2 of those 3 years, they got to know strangers like this. Like, what is that? That is what a stranger looks like to these babies. And if this carried on for 3 years, 4 years, imagine the absolute disaster that would have wrought on the psychology of newborn children. I mean, I was starting to worry about it. I was like, what society are we building 18 years hence? What is gonna, in 18 years when these people are adults, what people are we creating here? Mercifully, the thing ended after only 2 years, but I say only, but mercifully this thing ended. But again, I mean, when you think back at it, I get, like, I can feel my blood boiling now. Like just the pleasure that the political class got from this thing. It's sick, really. It's sick.
That's true. It is quite, man. I remember the minister, I think, was it of cooperative governance or something? The ones who had the power of issuing a national state of disaster. By the way, I mean, she pretty much became president. like the assuredness, right? Like, as I said, lockdown was a very eye-opening moment for me because it showed me the detachment in general reality that our leaders have, right? Because I don't think they understand the position that they are in relation to everyone else. They hold levels of power. They decide whether, as they were exercising, you can buy a cigarette or not. And the implications of that is that, you know, tobacco companies continue to generate revenues and the people employed by them, and the entire value chain continue to be economically active, and everything. They did not care. The fact that, like, the minister could stand there and say that she is justified in just killing off entire industries, and not even mention economic reasons in her papers. Like, if you read the court case which some tobacco manufacturers brought against, like, the government, there is no economic reasoning. And in her thinking, there's none, right? The fact that there's a dangerous thing out there in the world is enough to just shut off the livelihoods of millions of people. And the judge agreed with her. And the judge agreed with her.
And there wasn't even, I mean, beyond an economic reasoning, there wasn't even a health-related reasoning. It was just, you know, I'm the one who decides, and this is what I've decided. And there was no consideration of the economics, and there was only just this brief little kind of hand wavy kind of, oh, you know, it's important for health or whatever.
To help. And if you do remember, right, like, it was a very weird time because they got this directly from China. I remember I was even quoted by, who's this guy? David Freeman or someone from SA, a lefty, who said that I compared the lockdown to, you know, Chinese communism. I was like, man, that was great, right? But, because it was communism, and the fact that a lefty thinks of me as this crazy guy who compares, you know, state action to communism is amazing, because it means he reads my stuff. But they took the playbook directly from China. It was a playbook directly from China. The WHO had not even caught up yet, because the WHO was contradicting itself from saying masks are good to masks are not good to, oh no, a bunch of countries have already, you know, issued regulations saying people must wear masks, so we can't afford to make them look bad. So yeah, masks are good again, you know. So let everyone wear masks. It was a completely fiddling in the dark, and the people were like, it's okay to fiddle in the dark, it's okay, because admittedly no one had, you know, enough information, right? This is something that was happening in real time. Yeah, I'm sorry Morné, but they were saying that, you know, you can take away people's rights because, you know, we don't know what the fuck we're doing. And to me, that, yeah, we don't know. We don't know what the heck we're doing. But to me, that was a reason to not take away people's rights. That was definitely. I mean,
to me, it was always that contrast between the absolute certainty with which they take actions that impact millions of people's lives, and the absolute, you know, no basis in terms of knowledge. So we have no facts to support this. We are sort of fishing around in the dark, and we don't know quite what we're doing. But, you know, we're going to make sure that whatever we do is mandated. So initially it was the case that, you know, you were not allowed to wear a mask because they felt that, you know, we had to save resources for the medical personnel and so forth. And then it didn't become that, oh, you should wear a mask. It's, no, you must wear a mask, and we're going to arrest you if you don't wear a mask. And so that was just the fact that you went constantly between this, everything that is allowable is mandated, and everything that is, you know, looked down upon is prohibited. There was no in between. It was either you have to do this, or you're under no circumstances allowed to do this. But basically any decision regarding what you should do or shouldn't do was being determined by the state, which in any case, never really made much of an effort to convince anybody, because they didn't have to convince anybody. And just, sorry, on Martin's point earlier about the political class, and that's also something that I think about often, is just, you know, what's the current political order that we're in. And just for everyone, when you talk about a political order, it's basically the points at which everybody in the political system converge. That's the political order. So the political parties converge on those points, and the media and all those different centers of power converge. and just how dangerous it is, and just how important it is to really fish out when you are sort of deciding who to support or who not to support. Fish out what are the points of agreement, what is the actual status of the political order, because there was nobody in South Africa from a political perspective that wasn't basically in lockstep. There might have been slight tweaks here and there, but there wasn't really anybody who said that we're doing the wrong thing or we should be doing something else. In civil society, of course, but in politics, no. And I think that that's something to keep in mind today as well, is when you are trying to figure out where we are politically and you're trying to compare what political parties are doing, ask yourself, what is the current state of the political order? What are those points where everybody's coming together? And if it seems like there's a difference between parties, is it really a difference in kind, or is it just a difference in degree? And I think that we sometimes overestimate the differences between our parties. I think there's a lot of base assumptions. Like, for instance, is there any party which, if they were in power in 2020, that either of you think would not have done something very similar to what we ended up getting?
Maybe the ACDP. That's a big maybe, but maybe the ACDP. They were most vocal against some of the lockdown, but I wouldn't say that they would have necessarily swam completely against the current. But I mean, the point you make about kind of political order, I mean, I think in many respects, from speaking for myself, there is like the pre-lockdown Martin, the post-lockdown Martin as well. I mean, this thing was such an eye-opener in many respects, and kind of we were speaking earlier about kind of how people accepted this, and you mentioned it now again. In my kind of family circles, and certainly among some of my friends as well, the trust in the medical establishment has been kind of irrevocably, I would say, destroyed. And yeah, I would say that I'm relatively close to that, although I am trying to get myself back to a sense of normalcy. I think it's important to trust your doctor. It's a very specialized kind of field, and trying to kind of be your own doctor is always a recipe for disaster. But kind of, I think it's difficult to not come to that conclusion that actually something went wrong. And I mean, this is the point I made specifically at the time around the vaccines, but I think it applies more broadly as well. And that is that everything was okay while it was voluntary. It's like people can be anti-vax, people can be kind of kooky and so on. That's their right. This is a free society. But for as long as it's voluntary, me as in Martin, I probably want to get the vaccination because the doctors say it's good. I'm not a doctor. I can read papers. I can read conspiracy theories. Ultimately, I need to defer to the expertise of my trusted doctor. I can play games, but ultimately that's what I need to do. The second that the word must became introduced, I was like, wait a minute. I was gonna get the injection, but now when you said I have to get it, otherwise, not I'm gonna die. Otherwise, you're gonna throw me in a cage. Now I'm skeptical, and kind of around that time, I started feeling the government has added an army of essentially soldiers to its ranks in the form of doctors. Now I have to take kind of figuratively my hat off to the few dissident doctors, right or wrong. Like, I don't know if they were right or wrong. Right or wrong, they felt empowered. They felt comfortable standing up and saying, you know what, this is not on. We, for various reasons, we do not think that this should be happening. When 99% of their colleagues all cheered lockdown, they all cheered the mandatory vaccination. When, and I may be wrong, when before COVID, the kind of international understanding was lockdowns do not work, so actually don't do it. The medical understanding was you should not do this, and do not force patients to take vaccinations. Like, there was a time that when something called patient self-determination was like a cardinal principle of public health and of medicine. It's like, I will give you advice as your doctor, but it's your choice ultimately what it is that you put in your body and whether we operate on you. That is your choice. No, that all just disappeared. It's like, no, you will get this vaccination, rightly or wrongly. If you're objecting, you will get it. And our warning to you is not that you will die of COVID. Our warning to you is if you don't do it, you'll be arrested. To me,
well, yeah,
that's
or at the
one of
very
the
least you'll get
greatest
fired.
betrayal. Well, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But ultimately, like in my view, it's like, yes, there's these social consequences. But behind it all, like you alluded to this earlier, Morné, it's like with the moment when Ramampara made his last announcement, everyone stopped their impositions. Behind every imposition of any rule, including the mandatory vaccination for employment, was the corporate fear of state reprisal. That was always the kind of the underlying thing, that if we don't do this, maybe we'll be brave, maybe we'll do something, but if we don't do this, ultimately the state is going to come for us. Someone is going to get in state trouble. And that is the kind of, there was always this implication of state violence underlying any resistance to this thing. And now, yes, there's a lot of people who will be like, you just admitted that you would have taken the vaccination, so you're actually part of the problem. It's like, listen, I've never been a particularly kind of conspiracy inclined guy, and I've never been kind of part of the anti-vax thing. But I think we need to, as the post-lockdown generation, to some degree kind of leave that detail aside, because a lot of people make that the point of contention. It's like, you fell for it, you got the jab, or you are going to get the jab, and now you're the enemy. It's like, no. The key issue here is the involuntariness. The involuntariness and the degree to which society, and specifically doctors, and I haven't even gotten to churches. Good Lord. Good Lord. The churches went along with it. The state, like we have this idea in the back of every constitutional jurist and politician's mind, this fantasy of the separation of church and state. It is recited as a cardinal feature of constitutionalism per se. Like, it is one of the things that led to this notion that government is constitutional. There is a wall of separation between the church and the state. The government said, Ramampara said, the churches are closed. And the churches said, yes, sir. Church and state, my foot. My goodness.
Well, that's in South Africa in particular. And there were one or two sort of, very gentle kind of voices saying, well, I mean, from a religious perspective, depending on your religion, I mean, it does make sense to argue that we don't only care about your physical being, we also care about your spiritual being. So, and that, I mean, that was an argument I heard, but I mean, those were few and far between. And just regarding that, I can't quite remember, I think it might have been Mary Catherine Ham, who's a podcaster in America, but I think she made this sort of distinction that post-COVID, everybody keeps talking about a crisis of trust in institutions, but post-COVID, it's really a crisis of trustworthiness in institutions. And the institutions have shown themselves to not be trustworthy, and that's why people are starting to question them, or have started to question them. And like you said, Martin, it's that's one of the big issues here, is that they've just abrogated so much of the goodwill that they had. And I think there's still some of that on a more local level. People trust their particular doctors, but they don't trust the quote unquote medical establishment. And I think that has also given credence to a lot of other. I'm also not particularly conspiracy minded, although at some point all the conspiracies start to become reality, and then I do wonder, maybe I'm the idiot here. But yeah, I think that that's just I don't think anybody really put that calculus into it. It was such a short-termism, and it was such an absolutist kind of way of thinking. It has to either be, it was very binary. It was the one or the other. You have to either mandate it, or it has to be, it has to either contain microchips by Bill Gates, who asked Satan to put them in the vial, or it has to be, basically the equivalent of holy water that will cure all disease, and whatever. But it was just a time where it was. I think that's the time in which the extremes really came out. It was really a case of there was no real room to debate. There was no gray area for anybody. It's either the one extreme or the other, and either end thinks that the other one legitimately wants to murder everyone. They either genuinely want people to die from a disease, or they genuinely want to kill people with an injection. But yeah, I think that people also, even in that time, I thought that I don't think people quite understood how what a serious thing it is to have a foreign substance injected into your body. It's a serious thing. It's not something that you just take lightly. It was a very short period in which there was actually testing being done, and you don't know, given the millions upon millions of variables in your own body, how it's going to react. So it was an incredibly personal thing. It's having something that is a relatively new phenomenon literally injected into your body. And so to have, and in that context, to force people to do it. And I mean, I sort of have I remember that in that time, once you had a certificate that said you got the jab, you could pretty much do whatever you want. You could test positive for COVID, but if you had a certificate that said you got the jab, then, well, that's fine, because you're one of the pure people now. It was a weird kind of pure, impure. If you didn't have the jab, you were untouchable, but if you did, you're infallible. And those, and the other way around as well. But
that's true. That's true. It was crazy. I happen to frequent a whole lot of conspiratorial circles, right? I wouldn't say I'm conspiratorial myself. I have the Rothbard rule when it comes to conspiracies. If a certain institution is accused of doing certain things, which later down the line, when documents are declassified and it's found that it has done those things, then it is no longer a conspiracy. As you say, Morné, when the conspiracy is true, then it's truth. The conspiracy is the denial of said truth, right? But yeah, that is. But it was interesting to me seeing normies, as we'd call them in my crazy forums, having these conversations, right? Seeing normies like Martin who are like, maybe my doctor is not so great, right? So as in certain circles, people had already been screaming, and I like to look at it from the perspective of the people who are called conspiracy theorists, right? From like the original anti-vaxxers, which, by the way, have their own problems too, right? Like, as you said, there's no nuance in these things. But for someone who was on the other end of the spectrum, right, there are people who are pro-vaccine and the people who are anti-vaccine even before the lockdown, right? These were people who, when it happened, felt very vindicated why they were so adamant that they were not going to take it, because like their entire thinking was that it is optional right now. It is only optional right now. And before the lockdown, that is, right? So you have to take these measles vaccines and everything. But what happens when they say that you can't do A, B, C, or D? You can't, for your children, these mostly were like people who have families who are concerned about these things. And then when lockdown came and it was exactly as they feared, they just became, aha, we told you so. And then they just, corralled. That's why you even see, people who are fringe figures for decades, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now being in the seat of power within the US government. Because what happened after that moment is like it was a collective, aha moment for a whole lot of conspiracy theories who are like, oh yeah, we told you so. And then having, reports of like very young people suffering deaths, right, from like other heart attacks or anything like that, like even sports stars and something like this is something that is huge in the anti-vaccine community. They even have dedicated forums that just catalog, premature early deaths, as they call them, after the implementation of vaccines, and it just keeps on getting reaffirmed for them, like, oh yeah, we told you that they will literally want to kill you. And of course, the other side of it is that during lockdown, there are people who were dying of COVID, right? Like, and a lot of people who are opposed to the vaccine would not be willing to be like, hey, maybe those people actually were dying of COVID. So, that nuance, that lack of nuance is quite sad. But, if I were to choose, I choose liberty. I choose the people who are like, man, screw everything about this vaccine. I will not take a single ounce of it. Like those are my people. Right now, every time we talk about the lockdown, we're like, yeah, we were right, weren't we? Like, it's just sad though. And then the other, man, like the lockdown was so horrible, right? South Africa is still sitting with debt it got from the World Bank to buy vaccines, and the entire and the entire deal was closed off. I think it only got released due to a court order that was, that forced the government to release the terms of said deal, and it was not one of the most favorable of things. But the fact that our state was willing to go into debt to, finance something like mass vaccination of a population of over 60 million shows you.
Our state's
I'm
willing
like,
to go into debt for just about anything, so
just
they have
about anything.
they have
That's
no
true.
issue with going into debt.
Right? And I'm like, but though it's going into debt to the clear benefits of certain private companies, right? Like, and this is a conspiracy theorist in me to also come out like, if there were any winners that came out of the lockdown, those were pharmaceutical companies, specifically the ones who were making these mRNA vaccines that were being bought en masse by states. Like, any business wants to have the state as its customer, and these companies had states. They already did, right? The South African government already has a public health sector, so it already does give money to these people. But in comparison, it was not even close. There were even talks of building labs in South Africa that can, that can actually, construct this vaccine, and I'm like, oh man,
They weren't
that was
talks.
crazy.
Like, they built labs
Yeah.
in Port Elizabeth,
See?
so
Okay,
that we could
not
be. We were going to be the what is it, the highway to the rest of Africa. We were going to be the path through which all of Africa will get vaccinated. So it was in PE, and it was Aspen actually who got that contract
Yes.
with the sole South African licensees for the vaccine. I think they actually employed a lot of people on that basis. And if I'm not mistaken, they got a sum total of 0 orders because absolutely nobody in Africa wanted to buy it. People were either not interested, or they were sort of holding out to get the leftovers from the developed countries, or they were just too inefficient to get anything done. But yeah, they actually rejiggered a big section of their factory to manufacture the vaccine, and absolutely nobody got any vaccines.
Didn't we end up having so I may be wrong on this, but I faintly remember that when kind of the announcement was made that things are now returning to normal, we still had huge batches of vaccines kind of waiting, and that ultimately I think we gave them to some other country, or we had to destroy them because they kind of lost their potency. And it's like, it's not so much kind of weird to me that the state would indebt itself to get vaccines. Like, I don't think the state has a public health role. Just that, let me make that clear. I think that's a thing that doctors and hospitals and so on need to do. I don't think the state does that. But assuming that the state does have a public health role to play, sure, it indebts itself to get vaccines for people. But if it indebts itself to get vaccines for people, that it ends up like indebted with warehouses full of vaccines sitting, and now it's just like, well, okay, I guess we're not going to do that anymore. To me, that is it speaks to what I was saying earlier. It's like, if this whole thing had stayed voluntary, which to me voluntariness is necessarily associated with public health, then you wouldn't have had to do that. Like, the people who wanted vaccines would have been a lower number. People would have kind of queued for it. They would have gotten it, and you wouldn't have had to kind of get 55 million or 65 million vials of vaccine, assuming that every South African has to be vaccinated and then get their boosters for the next, what is it now, 2 centuries? You wouldn't have to kind of buy all of that, because it would be a market phenomenon. Those who were convinced by the arguments, those who were convinced by the doctors who said, yes, you need this works, don't worry, it's safe, they would then say, cool, put my name in, I want one. And then it wouldn't have been a problem. But they decided, we're going to politicize this. We're going to turn it into a command council. We're going to turn it into a kind of a lockdown. And yeah, I mean, then you have these perverse consequences of being indebted for stuff that people didn't end up using, and people aren't lying dead in the streets now because of it.
Yeah, and I think that, Martin, just on that point, I wouldn't even concede that it would necessarily have been fewer people. I think there's every chance that if you had just approached it from a voluntary basis from the beginning, there may even have been more people who were vaccinated. I think that a lot of the resistance, a lot of the hesitancy was the fact that these manifestly unreliable idiots are trying to force you to do this. And that's enough to get anybody to be skeptical about anything. If ever there was a reason to doubt whether the legitimacy of something, it would be because the ANC wants to force you to do it.
That was my experience. I was convinced. So I don't know if you remember, like Donald Trump was still president of the US, and he kind of pushed for this thing to kind of be fast tracked. And then when they announced they have a COVID vaccine, I was like, capitalism, wonderful. Like, look at the market. Like, there's this huge issue. Private enterprise, kind of private medical companies, they got the best experts, they did the little thingies with the little vials, and they got this wonder drug. Beautiful. What a beautiful vindication of my philosophy. You don't need the Stasi or the bloody state the departments of health to come and kind of develop these solutions. I bought into it. I thought, this is excellent. Great. The vaccine is there. We're going to get vaccinated. Cool. We don't have to panic about this unknown kind of Chinese virus anymore. But obviously, as Morné, you're like dead on the money. The second I started hearing these, it started as whispers. And then it started getting louder and louder. It's like, no, yeah, you will take it. I was like, wait, you convinced me to take it. Why are you now saying that I will take it? Like, you had me. You had me. Now you don't anymore. Now I'm wondering, why are you so eager to jab this thing into me, regardless of my feelings around it?
Yeah, it was the private businesses, it was the private institutions mostly, right? Particularly in South Africa, those were the ones who were willing to acquiesce to the public health recommendations of a whole lot of institutions that I will never trust again going forward. But any institution in health that is associated with the state, because those very same institutions are the ones that are pushing for the NHI right now. So really, the sad part, right, in South Africa was that they did not have to do that. These companies did not have to do that, at least concerning the vaccine, right? Like they did not have to do that. They did not have to threaten to fire people, make their employees take the vaccine. But I guess in their thinking is that, as Morné said, you take the vaccine and then you're pretty much back to normal life. You pretty much are okay. You can do the same things you used to do. So as from a business perspective, you're like, okay, cool. We want our employees to do this so that we can go back to operating how we used to operate, ideally. So, I get it from that part, but man, that to me from jump, right? From the moment that they were talking about it, any development of a vaccine, I was like, as I said, as a conspiracy theorist, 2020 was an amazing time because you got to experience everything in real time. Like, no way, right? No way. And then you see an immediate press statement from Dr. Fauci saying, maybe you should take those fucking vaccines. Huh? Like, oh no, he didn't. Oh no, he didn't. Yeah, but they did. So it was very interesting to see. But as I always say, liberty is an amazing thing. Why I always think it'll win, because when people get to a breaking point, I think. So even though the breaking points may not necessarily lead to mass cascading change, but it at the very least leads to a change in mentality. And we saw that in places all across the world, just like Martin was saying, that his trust in the medical establishment was pretty much just eliminated, it evaporated, and he's slowly trying to build it back up. So in the future, it will be much more harder, right, for him to be much more accepting of anything that may come from that medical establishment. And at a larger collective level, that's what you hope, that progressively it will be much more harder for tyranny to triumph over the long term. If you're looking at it from a bigger picture, it has to come to a breaking point, and people will have enough. So I hope that they have.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I mean, on I always reject Godwin's law, and I've rejected it a few times on this podcast. This thing about you're not allowed to refer to Nazi Germany, but to me, the Holocaust was one of history's kind of greatest collection of lessons. For lack of a better word, like that, when you want to learn something about the state, go and look at what the Nazis did. And I think lockdown was one of them as well. And Zakes, you make a very good point about kind of trust in the medical establishment, and maybe that builds up a little bit like a healthy skepticism of future absolutist pronouncements coming from the medical establishment. The other thing that I had hoped it would prove, because to me, I mean, I've always known that prohibitionism doesn't work. I mean, this is a meme, never works. 1920s bootleggers in the US doesn't work. They had to roll it back. But now you had cigarettes, and you were talking about this earlier, Zakes, in South Africa. So the illegal market in South African cigarette, the illicit trade, I think was more or less like 36 to I think 40 something percent in South Africa before lockdown. So that is a huge proportion of the cigarette trade. I mean, it's almost half. When lockdown came, it became something like 70 to 80% like of the cigarette trade. Like it was a huge explosion in the illicit trade. So the ban on cigarettes did not lead to people not smoking, as Zakes has now convinced us. You had your black marketplace, and yet like today, as we sit here in 2025, we're still considering a prohibitionist piece of legislation on tobacco. I'm not a smoker, but the tobacco bill is kind of relatively close to being adopted into law. And like I was engaging with it a little bit earlier this week, and I was thinking, didn't lockdown show us decisively that whatever it is that you're trying to do here just will not work? You're even like I wrote an article, it hasn't been published yet, but like this was around the budget speech. Gonongwana crying about kind of a lack in additional revenue, and it's like you are actively encouraging the growth of a non-tax-paying sector at the expense of one of the biggest tax-paying sectors in the country, the tobacco sector. You are closing down directly that kind of tax-paying base. And I was like, how could we have not learned this lesson? Kind of like we had this very recent repository of lessons that is lockdown, and this is one of them, and we're just like, no. And I think it comes back to what we said at the beginning, is that and understandably so, I think a lot of people are going out of their way to just block out that time of, like, it was 2019 and then 2022. There was no 2020, no 2021.
Yeah. And I mean, subconsciously, even, I don't even think it's you're doing it purposefully. I think a lot of us have just, it's as though those years didn't exist. I just happened to look in the mirror and I've looked 10 years older all of a sudden after 5. But yeah, I think, in the spirit of putting, blocking out the trauma, I mean, today is Human Rights Day. It's not Festivus, so we don't have to air our grievances at all. Let's talk about looking forward. It's Human Rights Day. It's been pretty bad in the past. There definitely is a legacy that's been carried over. But I mean, what are the sort of prospective kind of things for human rights? And maybe Martin, you can start, because it just gives some of the technical info on what do we mean when we talk about rights. I hear people say positive and negative, and all these different types of rights. It seems like in South Africa we mostly focus on the positive when it comes to rights, but on the negative in every other sense. And maybe just start us off with what does it mean when we talk about rights? What are some of the misconceptions about that? And then we can start talking about where are we heading?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very philosophical question, and philosophical answers tend to be long. But kind of basically, there's this distinction between what you said, positive and negative rights. I think that's problematic terminology. I mean, academically it isn't, but I think a lot of people, you just believe in negative rights. Look at how backwards you are. It's like, no. So the distinction, I think, that I summed up at a recent talk at Stellenbosch University is rather we must look at the various conceptions to liberty that are represented by these terms. And kind of the one that we believe in, I think, is the liberal conception or the libertarian conception of freedom. This is basically to say that the nature of you as a person, as an individual being born into this world, that process, that event of you being born into this world means something for jurisprudence. You are not born as part of a hive mind. You are born as an individual with a separate accountability taking and decision making mechanism. And as a result, that has some real world implications. That means you make decisions and therefore you should be tolerated to make decisions. And that's kind of the basis of the liberal perspective, that each individual must be allowed to make their decisions. And that is, I think, the kind of traditional, even common law approach to what rights are. But that's not, of course, the whole field of rights. We have what is called positive rights. I would call that the social democratic conception of rights, maybe a modern liberal, but I don't want to make that conception of rights, which is to say that yes, freedom is important. It does matter that we weren't born as a hive mind, but what really matters is that there is something wrong with different people being able to make more decisions about themselves than someone else could for themselves. So it's a concern with inequality. It's a concern with not everyone is enjoying the fruits of freedom equally. And therefore, the kind of conclusion that the Social Democrats reach from that, and unfortunately, largely South Africa's government is socially democratically inclined, is that the state must step in and even set aside some of those so-called negative or liberal freedom and rights so that we can get to a point where everyone exercises rights equally. Of course, we would say that that is an academic endeavor. It cannot happen. There is no such thing as a nirvana utopia where everyone can exercise their rights equally. Everyone is born different. Everyone kind of has different circumstances. So the enjoyment of your freedom will always be different from individual to individual. And then there is kind of a very some would say it's a very old conception of freedom and rights, but that is kind of what you would call the national conservative, the kind of new populist emergent notion of rights in the West. And this is this idea that freedom or rights as a concept is socially contingent, and there's no real definition of what this is, but it will be what your society deems it to be. So what we know as kind of civil liberties and so on is a very Western conception of rights and so on. But the Chinese and Africa and so on have these different ideas of rights, and we must kind of defer to that, and they must figure that out for themselves. So those are kind of the three approaches kind of to rights. I think that if we want the most conceptually clear conception of rights, of freedom, we have to go with the liberal conception, because our social democratic and our national conservative friends must and do, I think, ultimately, when pushed, concede that when you say the ability of the individual to make decisions for themselves and determine their own affairs without infringement or interference by others, they would all concede that what I have just said is the definition of freedom. So they might say that there's more to freedom, but they would ultimately have to concede that that is the basis of freedom. And I think that that is the conceptually clearest conception of it. And I think that is ultimately what we celebrate when we celebrate Human Rights Day or Freedom Day that's coming up later in the year, is this deference to the individual and the individual in his community, in his family, to decide for himself without someone else violently forcing him to do something else. And then just briefly what I think kind of on the way forward from here, and I think the way forward that does have to be a little bit back looking, and specifically in the context of lockdown. I do think we need some reckoning. I do think some people need to go to prison. It's really as simple as that. I think some of the elites in our medical establishment, in our politics, have to be tried for treason, ultimately. This was a brazenly unconstitutional kind of It's not a liberal versus a conservative or a socialist interpretation. It was just simply unconstitutional in any respect, and they got away with a humanitarian kind of violation of civil liberty. The as you said, Morné, the kind of likes of which has never really been known in human history. So I would say that there has to be that kind of reckoning, not just in South Africa, certainly in liberally inclined Western states as well. That reckoning has to happen. Maybe a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Maybe no one goes to prison, but like we have to just come to terms with what happened so that we can actually close off that period of history rather than just acting like it never happened. And then we can start looking at, are we doing the same things going forward that we did back then? Are we strengthening the Disaster Management Act, or are we going to fix the very small provision through which everything, the whole lockdown thing was forced? I think it's section 27(1)(n) and O, I think, were the provisions that led to this whole thing. Are we closing that gap? I mean, that's a very positive legislative agenda that I think we need to consider. So yeah, I think just on lockdown, those are potentially two of the things that going forward, I think need to happen for us to get some closure about our recent history.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
you said you were going to give a long philosophical answer, and you definitely did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Zakes, what about just beyond lockdown and those sorts of things? Martin's helped us with the distinction. There's the three different ideas of rights. You sort of got the, what is it, freedom from, the right to be free from hunger or destitution or the environment or something like that. The freedom from the human condition, I suppose. And then there's freedom to, which is the freedom to do as you please, or to not do as you do not want. And then that more community kind of thing, which I didn't know is that people argue is more of an Eastern kind of thing. It's definitely sounds pretty. I can think of a lot of Western philosophers. I mean, off the top of my head, Hegel had a very similar kind of thing.
No, I didn't say it's Eastern. No.
Yeah, he did.
Well, you said
it's actually Western populism. Yeah,
it's
a
Western
populist movement. Neoconservative.
National conservative kind of, no, not neocon. The neocons are the good ones. The national conservative kind of, very Western European kind of. But yeah, I mean, the East also is part of this. And what I said about the East was that the Western national conservatives say that the East has their own view of freedom and Africa has its own view of freedom, and we must defer to that. And there's no freedom per se or freedom in principle. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, Zakes, whatever type of freedom we're talking about, what's it looking like for you? I feel like most of the articles I've read so far in the lead up to today have been focused on when they talk about the state of human rights. And when you think about what the Human Rights Commission itself does, it feels like it's almost exclusively focuses on how good is the state at providing water, how good is the state at providing healthcare, how good is the state at providing housing,
all of these things,
and food, and whatever else you'd like. None of which actually falls into the negative freedom or the liberty or anything like that. There's no talk of what's the old saying that you can have a place to stay and a meal, 3 meals a day, time for exercise, your showers and everything whenever you like, time to socialize. All you have to do is go to prison. And yet people don't like going to prison. So there's clearly that's not really the kind of rights people think about when they talk about human rights. So what's the status? What's the status of liberty looking forward, as far as you can tell? Feel free to look back as well, but I'd like to sort of just get an idea of where are we with human rights, and human rights specifically meaning the right of a human to actually act as an agent,
do as they want. Yeah, do as they please. I mean, like, the whole, as much as we may like to put it in the most flurry of terms, but that's what it comes down to. Doing whatever the heck I want to do as long as I'm not hurting anyone. And this is why I love, what's this, and this article about vices by Lysander Spooner, and why I like Walter Block's Defending the Indefensible, because I think that it just, as a rhetorical point, it shows the whole deal with liberty is like, I can do this, and if I'm not hurting you, you better allow me to do it, or in the American sense, I will shoot you with my AR-15, which is unfortunate that we aren't allowed to have many of those in South Africa. But as for the prospects of liberty, right, it depends on from which perspective you're looking from. For South Africans who are libertarian inclined, right, you are like, oh man, I live in a society, as Martin said, that is very socially democratic, right? Even though there are constitutional provisions for negative freedoms. And I think the only time the South African Human Rights Commission is concerned about negative freedoms, it is when it is trying to sanction someone for free expression in some instance, and doing it in its usual inconsistent manner, right? So it is that's the only time they would really ever delve into, any any negative rights issues. In most cases that not, it isn't free expression. I think generally the South African legal sphere, right, like, negative rights are one of the least developed. I think the only adequately developed aspect of those rights would be the freedom to contract, which is not explicitly stated. And even that, our contract law is problematic in the deference it gives to legislation without even considering without even measuring said legislation. Of course, you're supposed to measure all legislation against the Constitution, but the contract law assumes that, of course, legislation should be okay. It is okay. Therefore, if a certain provision violates certain piece of legislation, you first have to challenge that legislation before said contracts can be valid. But that is the only aspect of our law that could say is developed that deals with like negative freedoms. Everything else, like the rights to trade, right, which is there in our Bill of Rights, is one of the least developed pieces of our law. So it is very concerning as a South African inside. You're like, oh man, liberty, it does not look good, right? And then you still consider that there are these provisions, they exist. I still have access to the courts. I still have, enjoy civil liberties in large degree. And this is where that comes in from, like, the outside looking in, right? I know a whole lot of people who weren't born in South Africa who emigrated here, because I'm fortunate enough to live in Jozi. So, and like, those people always tell me that South Africa is pretty much a nirvana when it comes to respect of human rights, right? Whatever you can think of, like, from right down to like the prosecution. I'm currently reading a story about the Zimbabwean journalist, by the way, who is currently in jail. The judge denied him bail because he conducted an interview with a political analyst, which pretty much said that, the Zimbabwean president is trying to get a kickback from the privatization of, I think, POSB, the People's Own Bank, savings bank in Zimbabwe. That's the name of the institution, which is ironic. But yeah, he's trying to privatize it. And this journalist conducted an interview, and there was actual, directive from the president himself. I won't go into the details of the story, but this guy is in jail, and the judge reserved judgment in his bail application, right? Like, having a bail application judgment reserved is pretty unheard of in South African terms. Instead, bail applications are pretty much formalities in South Africa, given our history, particularly with detention without trial, that I don't think even our most absurd of politicians would ever dare temper with, right? Because there's like a very vivid memory of people, families who still, have those memories of their relatives being taken to John Foster and really never coming back, right, for no other thing but just walking about. So from that perspective, from someone who was not, who is not as libertarian inclined as we would be, and looking at it from the outside, they would say South Africa is great, But as for going forward, we have seen lockdown was the first instance of a real, we can take down that. We can take that away from me. I wouldn't say, but at a mass level, right? We had isolated instances of the police, particularly police brutality, that never seemingly went away from Marikana to, I forgot, this man who was once murdered at a service delivery protest. And even after, lockdown. Yes. Thank you, Martin. But so you see, we've had those instances, but lockdown was the first mass instance of that. So look, going forward, it does not look good for any form of liberty, I would like to think, because now even the social democrats, right, it's going to be difficult to finance any of their spending requirements now because people's money is running out. So, so it's not looking good for any version of liberty in South Africa going forward. And yeah, that is sad. But I am realistically optimistic, particularly concerning liberty. I always think it can prosper.
And what about you, Morné?
Okay, well, I think, yeah, no, on the whole, I actually think people are, when it comes to our conception of rights, I think people might be slightly too pessimistic. I think that, and Zach sort of touched on this, is whenever you ask these questions, the questions always, compared to what? And I think actually compared to not just the rest of Africa, but even compared to, increasingly, to a lot of Europe and maybe even some of the Americas and so forth. I think that we have certain rights that we just take for granted. I don't think we realize how free we are in terms of expression in South Africa. I think that when it comes to free speech in South Africa, we actually do very well compared to most other countries in the world. Not everyone. The US is sort of in first place with a bullet there, but compared to the rest of Europe, compared to Africa, we generally can say whatever we want, and we can be as negative as we want about our politicians, and there won't really be any repercussions. Even in lockdown, we had those videos which were constantly taunting the effective dictator in chief at the time, Zuma. There were videos and there were memes and there were all those sorts of things. As far as I know, nobody got in trouble for that. I mean, yes, there are some sensitivities surrounding race and so forth, but on the whole, I think freedom of expression, we should recognize that we have a very high protection of that in South Africa.
They did try to outlaw mis and disinformation early in the lockdown, but it never went anywhere. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
But yeah, I think, and that sort of gets me to another point is when it comes to some of the other rights, I think we also experience a lot of rights in South Africa despite the state and not because of them, despite the inefficiency, thanks to the inefficiencies of the state. I think that if we had a far more effective state, we'd have far fewer rights in South Africa, because I think that they have an inclination towards encroaching upon rights, and it's really just their inability to effect that drive that they have that's protecting us. Unfortunately, I think that where we do suffer, and you can see that in terms of the outcomes, is when it comes to those economic rights, when it comes to the freedom to trade, the freedom of occupation, the freedom basically to do any sort of economic activity. That's where our government really cracks down. And I mean, that's why, even when it comes to the use of recreational drugs or something like that, they're perfectly happy to allow it, but they don't like you making money off of it. There's just something about economic activity that just really ruffles the feathers of our government. So in terms of social stuff, I think generally we're not actually in a bad position, and I think we sometimes underestimate how good we've got it in that aspect, in that respect. But economically, unfortunately, we do not bear the fruit, or do we bear the fruit? There's no fruit. There are no fruits to be born.
there's no fruits. That's the point.
Yeah, or there are fruits, but the government has taken them. Or something like that. Gorongwana has now put a tax on the fruits of our labor.
Which
is literally what happens. So I guess that analogy,
quite literally, that is his job.
So does that make it a very good metaphor or a very bad one? Because it really works.
No, it does. No, but I mean I think that's right. I did a paper for the Institute of Race Relations 3 years ago now, 2023, where kind of title is civil liberty in South Africa. And my conclusion is they're more or less kind of what you've said, in that, like, especially, I know we said we don't have to compare ourselves to Africa, but especially compared to Africa, if you're a transgender person, I mean, we like hating on the woke mind virus and so on, but I think in general, we still want transgender people to have the basic civil liberties that any other individual are entitled to. And in South Africa, that is how it works. But in the rest of Africa, big trouble, big trouble. And I think that's something that we need to be very proud of. And that applies to the whole LGBTQ kind of community. It certainly applies for,
Yeah, at least insofar as the government's concerned.
Yes, of course. We have a big crime problem in South Africa. I think we can all agree that violent crime in this country is atrocious. But that is, I mean, I mean, this kind of speaks to how rights discourse has become quite fraught, especially liberal rights discourse, our rights discourse, because the liberal conception of rights is very much, well, we need the state to come and protect our rights against criminals. But over the years, it has become, well, we need the state to stop attacking our rights, because so we focus on the state. But you're absolutely right. Like, the interpersonal violence in this country is a massive problem. But in the rest of Africa, I think it's flipped. My sense has been, and I haven't traveled very widely in Africa, but is that generally people are more peaceful. Like, my colleagues around the continent tell me that, geez, I mean, they love South Africa, but we really are violent. And like, I remember when Nigerians and Kenyans kind of visited us for a Liberty conference a few years ago, like, immediately they were robbed at Park Station when they came in. It's like, it's just, and they were like, what the hell is going on with you people? It's like, it's just normal. So yeah, but in the rest of Africa, it's poorer. Generally, I would say living standards are lower, but people kind of, they carry on with their lives. But the state there, if they see you're violating social norms and values and mores and so on, then you're either in prison or you're dead. So yeah, I think in that respect we do relatively well, even on stuff like privacy. I mean, what is called the basic rights, we do, I think, relatively well. And I think, yes, we lose sight of it because we do so poorly, I would say, on economic rights. Like Zake said, it's not, we haven't developed real jurisprudence like the Americans have around freedom of contract, around the right to free economic activity, even though we have a constitutional right to do that. Our common law, I think, is relatively strong, but that strength is kind of useless in the face of the principle that legislation always overrides common law. So that is, I guess, the new area of contestation, or not, well, it's not new, but the area of contestation that we as liberals, I mean, just out of the nature of things, are interested in, is that we want to push back against the incursion on economic liberties. And the lockdowns, I guess, were the exception, because, yeah, it was certainly an attack on economic liberties, but it so basically attacked the so-called basic rights as well, of movement, worship, etc. So yeah, I think there is a glimmer of hope in that we still have these strong mechanisms through which we can push back against the state, especially freedom of expression, the right to privacy, and so on.
Yeah. Although I don't want to sound too sanguine about it. I mean, no. I don't want it to sound too rosy, just because, I mean, if you refer to, what did you call it, the basic or the core?
Some people call them basic rights. The kind of social rights, the personal rights.
Yeah, I think one way of looking at it is also just to say, to what extent is the state doing the three things that John Locke said it's supposed to do? What's protect life, protect liberty, and protect property. And I think that it's shown itself to be incapable of protecting our lives. You have to take steps on your own. Liberty, I don't think it's necessarily that they're protecting it, but they've proven themselves to be ineffective in encroaching upon it to some extent. And property, up to this point, I don't think we've actually been bad on property rights. But for some reason, we keep wanting to, shoot ourselves in the foot here. I don't know. It's one of the few things we've had that was going relatively well. And for some reason, we can't have that. We can't have us actually performing okay-ish on a particular score. But yeah, I mean, if that's the way you look at it, then of the three, maybe 2 out of 3. And
No,
the third,
that's
we're doing our level best to get that one chucked out as well. But
no, I would say,
but yeah,
according to Locke's definition, the state has broken the social contract. I mean, I think that's a relatively straightforward conclusion. It's not protecting our life, liberty, and property. It's failing to deprive us of them in many cases. But yeah, I mean, the real protection comes maybe from the courts every now and then, but it's going to be a private security guard, or it's going to be yourself. And in other respects, you're afraid of the state.
Yeah, no, Locke was problematic. The state, by its nature, erodes all those things that maybe outside of life you could say that. But it is the truth. It is the truth. So it's like, let's just compare, tyranny to tyranny. Like, yeah, I mean, the state exists, Mr. Locke, sir. Tyranny is established. Full stop. But yeah, that is the anarchist in me.
Yeah, and then in the future, I'm sure we're going to get deeper into it. But yeah, I mean, Morné, if any of you have any final notes, but I think we're probably
I think we might be done. I wanted to end for the people. I'm sorry, man, for the people visiting South Africa, right? So South African proverb. I always ask people when they tell me they were robbed. I'm like, what were they doing? What were you doing to get your stuff taken away from me? So I think. Yes. You see, when you've developed a whole lot of normalization of trauma, you start identifying with the perpetrators of crime, and then you start seeing yourself in them. You're like, actually, you deserve to have your property taken away from you, because that's what the question implies. But yeah, the crime issue is always funny to me, because I'm a Josie boy, so every time I hear people say I got robbed, a part of me, a very toxic part of me, is like, man, you must have been a mark, weren't you? They must have seen you from a mile.
I think it's time to detox you from Johannesburg.
Fair. I don't think that would be a good thing, but fair. Too much of anything is bad.
Yeah. Okay. Morné, any parting words from you?
I've got nothing.
Okay, cool.
On that high note.
On that very high note, happy Human Rights Day, everyone.
Yeah.
We have a lot of things to think about on a day like this. There are a few things that we can be very thankful for. There's a lot we need to be kind of concerned about and be kind of eternally vigilant about. And especially when you start seeing people reporting on new viruses and what the government is going to do about it, be very skeptical, especially from now on. There hasn't been a reckoning. People are trying to forget for understandable reasons. But yeah, let's not forget what happened, and let's at least learn from it. I think that's the best we can do, kind of, at least for now, and hopefully in the future, maybe something a little bit more substantive. But that's it for the Rational Standard this week. Thank you for joining us. Please, as always, leave comments and shout at us if you think we completely got it wrong. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, please share it with your friends. And above all, if you're interested in more content, please subscribe to the Rational Standard channel. And I believe there's some bell icon that gives you notifications when we've uploaded a new show. So it's every Friday. And yeah. Again, thank you for joining us. Enjoy your long weekend, and we will see you next week. Cheerio.
Cool.